Welcome to this episode of Video Learning Lab. I have a very special guest today, one of the biggest voices in helping educators move into the field of instructional design. Devlin, it's good to have you.
It's good to be here, Kevin. Thanks for having me.
All right. So you have a boot camp, a community of instructional designers, and a lot of great content on YouTube and other channels. And it seems like everywhere I look, there's someone who's interacted with a piece of your learning content. And so I'm sure the road to here was not an easy one, and you've had to build your company up piece by piece and content piece by piece. So just to start off, can you tell us a little bit about the beginning of this journey and where you got started in instructional design and how you got to here?
Sure. Yeah, I got started pretty early. So I was in college, I was an undergrad, and I was really interested in teaching. So I was like, I really want to either teach high school English or pursue a PhD and like take the gamble on maybe getting like a tenure track role, even though every professor I talked to was like, that's probably not going to happen. It's like really rough out there. Um, so I still had that in mind, but my senior year of undergrad, while I was like interviewing at some like private high schools to teach English, I got this part-time job. I applied for like a really basic part-time journalism job, and they interviewed me and they're like, "Hey, looks like you'd be a good fit, but there's no room on the journalism team. We actually want to bring you onto the training team." And
Mm.
so again, this was like 10 hours a week, like super minimal, but I started getting some experience doing that. And it reminded me of this instructional design presentation I had seen at my university through the College of Education, like a couple of years prior to that. And I was like, this is weird. I've never heard of this. I think I Googled it once and I was like, huh, yeah, seems interesting. And then kind of moved along. I was like, I want to teach. But after kind of just happening into the field like this through this really low commitment kind of job, I started looking into the master's program at my university more and like looking more about the opportunities in the field. And I was like, wow, this seems like there's pretty good opportunity here. Like the pay is pretty good. Like the work satisfaction seems like really good. And a lot of this seems like it could be done from a computer, at least from the e-learning development standpoint. So I was like, I got
Mm.
it in my mind because I really wanted to travel. I was like, maybe I could do this. I could still help people learn. I could still use my writing skills because I was very passionate about writing. And I love technology. So, and I could use tech while like working from my laptop and traveling Europe, traveling abroad. That was like
Yeah.
the idea I got in my head. I'm like, I'm going to do this. Maybe I could be freelancing and like set my own hours. No idea if this is even possible, but worst case, I can get like a corporate job making a decent living and I can shut down at the end of the workday and not have to think about work. So that was the impetus into instructional design. Yeah.
Yeah, you're kind of thinking about work-life balance before it was cool, essentially, where you're envisioning the life that you had, and I'm grateful that you're able to figure that out that early on in the game, because I know that with educators it's more of like a almost like a realization, or you get to a point. I know for me personally, you get to a point where you're either burnt out or you're realizing, hey, this is maybe a little bit more than I actually signed up for. There's aspects of the day-to-day job that are really tough. So I'm grateful that you got a chance to explore that before you got to that point. That sounds tough.
Yeah, I had this really good like English teacher in high school, which is what made me want to get into this. And then every teacher I talked to, starting like my freshman year of college, like and on, I would talk to teachers about my goal, and they're like, "What? Like, why are you doing that?" And then they're like, "Oh, well, I guess like someone has to do, I guess like the new generation has to change things, but it's like miserable." And then my mother-in-law has been a teacher for like over 30 years, and I see like just how much she has to work and all the stuff she has to deal with. So yeah, a lot of different teachers in my life that were feeling very burnt out and not super happy. I
Yeah,
think.
no, that definitely makes sense. I think I want to squeeze the most out of every second with you here today to talk about
Right.
instructional design. But
Yeah.
before we dive into the fundamentals, I think a question that's been on my mind, and a little bit about your audience. You're working with those transitioning educators going into instructional design. What is the biggest obstacle for those educators? Because they do instructional design in one form, and then there's the instructional designers, the people with the title, or learning designers, whatever our industry is going by these days. What's different about, or what's the biggest obstacle or the biggest gap between that classroom instruction and instructional design outside the K-12 space?
Yeah, good question. I think teachers are all they already are pretty familiar with how people learn. They have a
Yeah.
generality of how to design learning experiences. Like they're good at that. They're good at seeing what the gaps are and helping people bridge those gaps. And at its core, that is a lot of what instructional design is. The tool set that instructional designers or learning designers use, I would say, is very different than what a teacher would use in a classroom setting,
Hmm.
especially because, yeah, teachers, if they are designing learning, they're also the facilitators, right? They're getting in front of the class, they're working with these students every day. Whereas instructional designers, yeah, you're often working more behind the scenes. You're doing more of the design. So you're working with the subject matter experts, you're designing the lessons. And in a lot of cases, especially with this like remote first kind of movement, a lot of
Yeah.
the work now, it already was before, but a lot of it is this like self-paced e-learning experience where there isn't going to be a facilitator to answer questions or, yeah, guide people through things. It's like, here's a self-paced learning experience. It's a little bit different designing something like that with tools like Articulate Storyline, um, and using a different set of principles of, yeah, what makes for a good multimedia learning experience without a facilitator compared to a good like facilitator-led classroom experience. So, and then there are just the cultural differences too of like working in corporate, which is where a lot of these educators are transitioning into, as opposed to working in an education setting.
Yeah, and there's something in there about, when you have that face-to-face instruction, you're able to deliver your key point, but then you can see maybe in real time a student's reaction. You have all this other information to assess. Is this learning sticking? You're able to you have a very controlled group of students as well, where you get the benefit of the whole year of looking at their development plan. But I definitely hear what you're saying, where if you're designing, let's say, asynchronous e-learning, it's not that you set it and forget it, but you set it and then you kind of wait for the results to come in or wait for the feedback to come in. And so there's that huge there's that huge gap between what you said or what you put down and then what's being received. And I understand that's a huge challenge. Can you talk a little bit more about the tools gap and why that's such a big hurdle to overcome?
Yeah, I honestly don't know if it's like a massive hurdle. I would say, I mean, the first and maybe biggest hurdle to overcome is accepting that you're going to need to upskill if you're coming into
Mm,
instructional design from education. I think that's a really common mistake where people are like, yeah, I do know how people learn. I've been helping people learn for like 5, 10, 30 years.
yeah.
Instructional design is all about helping people learn. Like, I can do that. Let me send in my resume to 100 open roles, and surely I'm going to get an instructional design job. Like, they'll see my valuable experience. And then you might not get a single interview doing that. So that, I
Yeah.
think, is the biggest obstacle. But once the people transitioning into the field realize, okay, I might have this very valuable like knowledge, experience, and skills, but it looks a little bit different in corporate instructional design, and I'm gonna have to put in some work to learn the tools that I might have never used before, and to build a portfolio to show off what I can do, and actually take these steps to set myself apart from maybe hundreds or thousands of other teachers who aren't doing those things. Yeah, might not be doing.
Yeah.
But the tool itself, like Articulate Storyline, I think that's like probably that is the most popular like e-learning authoring tool for these self-paced experiences. Like, I don't think it's particularly difficult to learn. It's very similar to PowerPoint. It's not like, oh, I'm going to teach myself how to do like software engineering from scratch. Like, you can learn
Yeah.
the basics in anywhere from a few hours to, a week or so.
It seems scary when you look at these polished presentations or you look at animation in
Yeah.
in any of these tools and think, I don't know anything about video, I don't know anything about animation, but I for the bulk of the work that I've had to do in instructional design, it's actually very simple what's actually required for you to master, and you can learn that if you put in the time. And I know you've got plenty of tools to help folks get on the road to that. You've been talking a lot about how to get started in instructional design, and you've rounded up kind of these 5 tenets for us to talk through. And there's a lot to discuss, and I don't think we'll cover the entire breadth of instructional design, but I think that these 5 are fundamental for the success of those who are creating learning.
Yeah, and the context for these tenets are, I'm like, people who may not know about instructional design, what are some very simple, yeah, principles that would be, yeah, a good kind of like mantra kind of to remember to help guide some of these design decisions or process decisions. But yeah, your audience holds the key. That one was, yeah, really important to me, and probably the most important one, because a lot of the learning projects I was working on, even when I first got my foot in the field, the audience was nowhere to be found. So, I was talking to the client, um, but yeah, access to the people who are actually going to be taking the learning experience and like presumably benefiting from it, and making a difference in their lives so that it can produce results for the organization. They weren't at the table, and like yeah, that I think is the most important piece. So I was getting pretty frustrated with some of the instructional design work I was doing because the stakeholders I was working with didn't really see the value of bringing learners into the discussion that
Interesting.
early.
Mhm.
And so I felt like I wasn't really making a big difference because I'm like, how do we know what these people really need, what their feelings are, like how they're going to respond to a learning experience like this if we can't ask them? And so then when I started creating my content, which was very soon after I got into the industry, probably within the first year of me working on projects and doing my master's degree, I was starting to create these tutorials to like solve problems that I was facing that I knew other instructional designers were going to be facing as well, like
Mm.
particularly technical problems in the beginning. So then
Mhm.
getting feedback and work like focus grouping it kind of with people in the field, like asking my peers or my classmates, like, hey, are you able to follow this tutorial easily? Like, what's your experience like going through this? And then posting it, sharing it on LinkedIn and getting some feedback like that, and being able to kind of rapidly like iterate on my free content for other instructional designers. That's where I started feeling like I was making a real difference and getting people telling me, hey, this saved me a lot of time. This helped me a lot. um yeah, going back to your very first question, like that's where it started kind of pushing me more and more towards creating the content. I was like, I like this. I'm in direct contact with my audience.
Mm.
They're telling me what they need. I can look at that data. There isn't like yeah, anyone like obscuring that access, so to speak. But
I think so, yeah. Something that's really cool about that is you're you were in a position where you didn't have an audience, and so you're kind of thought outside yourself. There are other people in this position. There are other people who are facing the same day-to-day problems that I'm having, and so therefore, you kind of had to start somewhere. You had to build these tutorials and then focus group them and check them. And I think that's something that a lot of instructional designers, they struggle with, where it's like, oh, I don't have an audience. I don't quite know what I'm creating. And I think the reality is what you described. You don't have access to everyone who's going to inform a really good audience analysis. And so your approach was then to build, measure, learn, or build, test, measure, learn. And you were then, it sounds like, I guess, what was the next step? Because you have these tutorials, which are kind of these like individual piecemeal courses, but then where do you go from there?
I would say, yeah, advocate for a line of communication with the audience. Whether that's, can I send out a survey to learn more about the audience? Can I put together a small kind of focus or test group that we can get feedback on this prototype with? Like that, I think, is one of the most powerful things you can possibly do when you're working on a learning experience. Instead of, let me build this entire thing, then we'll roll it out, and maybe now for the first time it's seeing more than a couple of people, and then we'll measure feedback on it over the course of like a year and maybe make some updates
Mm.
at the end of the year in our like annual review. It is so much more effective if you can say, hey, can we loop in a group of 5 to 20 people, and I can meet with them once a week and kind of get feedback on this prototype as I build it. Like that's how I built all of my offers and my business. I think that would work really well on the corporate side too. Getting a
Mm-hmm.
prototype and putting it in front of people. It's like the SAM model or some of these like agile, like ADDIE approaches. It's like, we're going to do some light analysis, right? Gather some information that we can, then design and develop a prototype, which might be on a piece of paper, or it might be some really basic like PowerPoint slides just to show the proof of concept, and then present it to people who are actually going to be going through it or who would have gone through it recently had they like got hired, a little later, for example. So put it in front of people that actually need the content, need the practice, need the information, and see what their feedback is about that. That's going to help you make decisions much more effectively than, I don't know, a lot of other tools we have at our disposal. Like, let's sift through the archives and look at some research to back up this decision. It's like, if you have your audience telling you, hey, this is going to be super, super helpful for us, like that
Yeah.
takes precedence. Yep.
And just in general, what are you looking for with that feedback when you're doing these iterative prototypes?
I'm looking for clarity issues, like this isn't clear, I'm not sure about that, or also content. So it's like, would this be helpful to know here? Would it be helpful to get some practice with this, or do you want to like dive right into this next section? Yeah. So, and I guess it's very closely tied to like relevance. Like, is this going to help you accomplish this goal that we're set out to accomplish here? Can you see this helping you, or does it feel like it's wasting your time? Visuals or presentation things too. It's like, is this clear how you can like interact with this? Any feedback here? Honestly, any kind of design decisions where we're like, I feel like this could be a little bit better. But
Mm.
I even will like review kind of updates. It's like, here's what we're thinking, here's what we have. What do we think about this?
Mhm.
And then sometimes, yeah, you don't, might not even foresee what the issue might be, or think to ask about it specifically.
Yeah. And then what are the, you're talking about this experimental iterative approach with focus groups. I think it's great you get these bits of feedback along the way to help you tweak your design and make sure that it's effective before you launch it to the wider audience. What are the consequences of not doing that? Let's say you don't have access to your audience, you build to the stakeholder vision. What happens what could happen if you don't go through that process of nailing down your audience?
I think that the likelihood of the learning experience being effective and actually helping you move closer towards your goals is going to be severely reduced. Like, I think it's going to be really hard to confidently say, hey, this is really going to help people. This is really going to make a difference in these people's lives. It's really going to help them do their jobs better. It's really hard to say that if they haven't been looped into the discussion at all. In situations where you don't have that access, it's really about making like your client happy. And your client might be a project manager, might be an executive, and might be, yeah, a head of learning. And maybe they have a really solid idea of like what the audience's needs are. And that's great. If they do, then yeah, probably will be, yeah, much more likely to be successful. But in a lot of cases, these people who are commissioning these projects have a lot of other things going on, and they have a lot of assumptions that are guiding a lot of their decision making. And yeah, as an instructional designer, we have a lot of tools on our belt to verify those assumptions and to actually talk to the people who this is for. But yeah, I think the risk is build the learning experience, spend a lot of time, a lot of effort from you as the
Mm,
designer and um, any other stakeholders you're working with who are reviewing this and contributing. And then it rolls out. People get through it as quickly as possible, maybe because it's mandatory, or maybe they
yeah.
don't need, or maybe it's not mandatory and they never go to it because they didn't need it in the first place. So that's a whole bigger discussion about analysis and and all of that.
Yeah.
But yeah, the
Yeah.
risk is useless, ineffective e-learning or a learning experience that isn't going to make any impact.
Yeah. And just something that you just mentioned right there at the end is that a lot of training in the corporate space is assigned. And I think a lot of folks see that as a green light. Well, their boss said so, and so therefore I'm going to create what the boss said, and they'll have to do it. But that doesn't necessarily mean the outcome is going to be the actual audience member or the actual end user learning or applying that new skill or leading to business impact just because they had to do it or they had to check off a box. The next tenet that you have on here is alignment is everything.
Yeah, I think for this one specifically, I was talking about alignment with the learning goal and learning objectives, just because I think that is such a fundamental like instructional design principle, and it can be such a useful, yeah, tool for making decisions about what to include, what not to include, and scope and things like that. And I think it ties to a lot of other principles, such as, like related to cognitive load and like including like irrelevant information or like fun facts. It might not support the learning goal or the learning objectives. It could be nice, it could be fun to know, but like it's not actually moving you closer towards your goal. It might be taking you down the wrong direction as a designer.
How do you approach that? I know a lot of folks talk about, backwards design and making sure that they're building backwards from an outcome, but how do you ensure that everything is aligned when you're thinking about creating learning?
Yeah, I think in the simplest sense, it's what is our goal here? Like, why are we even designing a learning experience? Or maybe it's before that, why are we even making any efforts here? Maybe you don't want to
Yeah.
assume that a learning
Yeah.
experience is the answer yet, but what are we trying to accomplish? Assuming it's a learning experience, um, yeah, what do people need to know or be able to do in order to accomplish this? And so I think
Yeah.
there are different ways to go about it. You can start with the business goal, right? We're trying to move this metric by this percent and use a more like action mapping kind of approach. And then what do people need to do in order to get us, closer to that goal or make that happen? And then there's like a traditional approaches where it's like, here's our learning goal. We want people to be able to drive cars safely, on American roadways. And
Mhm.
then it's, what do people need to know or be able to do in order to drive safely on American roadways? And then each objective might, it's like, well, they need to know what all the different signs mean. Then you could break that down into probably 20 to 30 objectives about identifying and responding to the different signs. So
Yeah.
it
Mhm.
turns into like a really kind of deep, detailed outline if you're using that traditional approach of, learning objectives and breaking those down, terminal, enabling. It can get kind of, like complex and wordy, but at its core, I think it's what are we trying to accomplish? What do people need to know or be able to do in order to accomplish that? Let's not teach them information or skills that aren't going to actually get them closer to that goal just for the sake of, oh, this will be nice to know, or oh yeah, this subject matter expert that says that this is important, let's throw that in. It's a good kind of like way to put blinders on. It's like, we're in pursuit of this goal. If other stuff is kind of coming into the mix, we need to push that away. We need to stay aligned with our goal, and not just with content, but also with activities, assessment questions. It's like any practice activities we want to do, we want it to be directly in support of either the goal or one of the objectives that are enabling the goal. We want to let people practice, which I think brings us into our next one. But
well, before we go into that one, I am excited to talk about that one because that's a juicy one. But when I think a conversation that comes up time and time again, you're in the instructional design world, is this kind of story of the instructional designer as the order taker. And, a lot of stakeholders will say, we need training, and a lot of folks are kind of caught between a rock and a hard place. I think, if you look on LinkedIn, the most common advice is to say like, no, do we actually need training? But the reality of it is that if you're starting out as an instructional designer, it's hard to get alignment that, is training even going to be the solution? And I'm curious, how do you coach people through that process, or what do you tell them if they're starting out as an entry-level instructional designer? A training request comes down, they have the business objective and kind of the metrics that they're targeting, but a senior stakeholder says, this is a training, it needs to happen.
Yeah, I don't think there is an easy answer for that. Like, I struggled against that even as a freelancer for years and trying different approaches and seeing what will work. And there would be small wins, but it's not like if I say the right words, these executives or key stakeholders are going to change their mind and give me full agency over the solution. Like, I think it takes some time, or at least a really good track record, to kind of build that trust and attract those types of clients. My portfolio was all e-learning and like cool interactions, maybe in little games and stuff like that. They're not coming to me to, change their, metrics by a big percent. And like, and I started presenting myself differently, but still it was like, I didn't have case studies of, here are these big metrics I moved and with these big clients I worked for. Like, I think it takes a lot of social proof and like credibility to just come into a business and get that, get that freedom. So I think that people have some success, taking steps in the right direction. It's like, well, first, let's conduct a survey to see what our audience, learn more about our audience here, and like slowly start implementing more and more of those things. Like, I think action mapping has some good suggestions on how to handle that conversation. And instead of like immediately being resistant, it's kind of like, it's kind of redirecting the conversation to a goal and then asking questions about how we can achieve that goal. And it's kind of like, instead of saying, oh no, we're not going to do a course, it's like, we're not even going to have that resistance right now. We're not going to like push back on each other like that. We're just going to dive deep into the problem and what we need people to actually do. And then we can make the case for how we can get people to do what we need or want them to do most effectively. But it is tricky. I set expectations. I let people, because that was a wake up call for me. Like, in my master's program, you learn how to conduct these needs assessments and how to do all this analysis and how to make a real actual difference with instructional design. And then you get hired into these roles, and like that first role I had that I mentioned, I was like, I got promoted to like a training team lead, but I was like, we're doing PowerPoints and Google Slides. And I'm like, yeah, let's help people practice. And it's like, oh no, we view training as a way to spread information. So I'm like, that's like the antithesis of what I want to do. Like, I want to actually change behavior and like make a real difference here. So sometimes it just feels like you're fighting an uphill battle. And I'm like, I need to leave this. Like, I'm not going to grow here. I'm not going to make the impact I want to make here. So I think it's always a question of, go ahead. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, no, I got too excited because I think something that's coming out of this is, really, is a company expecting a training initiative, if it is in fact training, to be the sole driver of this business metric. If that's the only thing that's going to, give an uptick in numbers, then that company is probably in trouble, because there's probably also processes that need to happen. There's also coaching and environmental things, and just the problem is probably going to be much larger than training itself. And so I think, what I'm taking away is also be realistic about, do action mapping, get to the core of the problem, understand your audience and what the stakeholder is trying to say, but also be realistic about what exactly the impact of what you can create in a training space or an asynchronous course, how much that's going to impact that business metric. Is it really the only thing? Is that fair
Yeah.
to say?
Yeah, I think it's probably, very rarely, if ever, it's like this problem will be completely resolved if the employees have this new knowledge or these new skills. Like it's
Yeah.
usually a combination of a lot of different things, environmental factors, like different motivational concerns, which again could be due in large part to the environment, compensation, um, all sorts of things like that. And I think if you are new, like I worked with some teams as a freelancer and they would do that performance consulting piece and they would have the reports of like their analysis findings, and they had a really deep understanding of like the situation, the problem. And then they viewed the learning component as like, one prong of this like multi-pronged approach. Like they were really effective in it. Like there are teams like that out there. And if you're passionate about performance improvement, and you are brand new, I would say, definitely try to join a team that already does think that way. And I've seen some people find success talking this way on landing roles on teams who are like, we want to move in that direction in the future. Right now, we're churning out, 10 courses a week, but we want to be able to do that in the future. So we're going to take on someone who like knows how to talk that talk and can help us eventually walk that walk. But again, it can be frustrating if you're like itching to itching to use more of a performance consulting approach, but the team that you're on is really resistant to it.
Yeah, and just because there's a lot that you said in there that's so valuable, I think for entry level instructional designers, you're also calling out the fact that this is just the start of your career. There are many different ways that instructional design is a very broad field. There are many different roles and niches within that, and there's a lot of different places to go.
Yeah.
All right. So we talked about skills, and I didn't mean to cut you off earlier, but that third tenet is practice and feedback make perfect. So can you tell us a little bit about, why practice and why feedback, looking at those two as two distinct things here?
Yeah, when it comes to skill building, I think that's like the most effective thing that you can possibly be designing for, is to let people get these practice experiences in this risk-free environment. And everyone hears that, knows the saying like practice makes perfect, right? I feel like we've
Yeah.
been hearing that for so long, but the feedback component is the missing piece there, or maybe the implied piece, but it's equally as important, especially important for us to think about as instructional designers. You can tell someone, oh yeah, go out there and practice kicking that soccer ball for 10 hours a day, get out there and, get to it. If you have one person doing that and another person out there with a coach who can give feedback after every kick, it's going to be very different results between those two, the learners, so
Yeah.
to speak.
I've heard amendments to that where it's like, if you think about, what's the metric, 10,000 hours, but it's
Yeah.
10,000 hours of purposeful practice. And then there's also, maybe it's implied or that's completely missing, that feedback. You have to have somebody who is able to recognize what good looks like so that you can kind of lead someone there. I'm curious, when you're designing, a lot of early stage instructional designers are making courses. And if you're a transitioning educator, we talked about that before. It's like the biggest gap is you're facilitating face-to-face instruction. You have so many points of feedback, so many opportunities to add purposeful practice into your daily instruction. But I guess, how do you balance kind of the learner's need for practice and feedback with other instructional goals and constraints, like, your time or the fact that it's an asynchronous course?
I think that's one of the best ways to make an asynchronous course more effective. And I think right? There's a lot of talk about interactivity. It's always like, yeah, make it more interactive. Like, oh yeah, we want these different interactions. Like, especially when I was getting into the field, um, yeah, interactive equaled higher production value and like better. But incorporating interactivity just for the sake of like making it interactive, like it's kind of that, I think that is kind of a waste of time on the designer's part, the developer's part, and the actual learner's part. It's like, click these different things to like see the information appear. It's like, well, there's nothing meaningful about that. It's just like clicking for the sake of clicking. But when you can make an asynchronous or self-paced learning experience interactive for the sake of like providing practice opportunities, that makes the interactivity much more intentional. And yeah, you actually are, there is a learning benefit from that. And instead of thinking of like, oh yeah, I need to make this more interactive, like how do I add interactivity? Instead, it's like, what knowledge do I want people to practice or like memorize better, or which skills do I want people to practice applying? That's where I need to draw my interactive like practice activities from. So
Mhm.
on a very basic example, if someone needs to like memorize some key vocab, you can design like a practice flashcard activity as part of the experience. If it's something, if it is like an information-based like traditional course, the practice activities could be these knowledge checks or these quiz questions. And then the feedback comes in instead of, answering, and then it's like, oh, this is correct or this is incorrect, try again. You can give some more detailed feedback to help people make the right choice next time and reach that deeper level of understanding. And then my favorite is when we get into the scenario based learning, and you can practice making decisions in these like story driven environments. So it's like, now you're going to get some practice as this person working on the job, try to make it through the day without upsetting any customers, for example. If we're like a
Mm.
cashier or something, then you're like at the cashier, register, someone comes through and they like make a complaint or want to return something, then it asks you like, how do you want to respond? And then if you make the wrong choice, you see that story driven consequence, and the customer gets upset or, just walks out without paying, or those sorts of experiences. I have the most fun designing and developing. And when I was doing client work, I got to a point where I was exclusively working on those kind of projects. But regardless of what type of project it is, practice and feedback are really important for making the learning experience more engaging and effective.
What's the one I really like what you're talking about it, the difference between just knowledge checks and making sure that maybe that bit of knowledge is sticking in there, and then with scenario based learning you're getting into that decision making, which to me is the ultimate goal of training employees. It's you don't necessarily want them to have just know that something is good or bad. You want them to be able to act on that. So I think scenario based learning is, it's a bit more, there's a bit more design into the experience that goes into that, and thinking about how these characters interact in a world. But that is, kind of, if you go a next step up in terms of, this isn't just know how to do this, it's I can recognize this obstacle on the job, and I can then make hopefully the right decision. And when you make that decision, I think that's what leads to that upper level business impact. So what does good feedback look like in an asynchronous course?
Again, I like the feedback in these scenario based experiences that is story driven and not like prescriptive at all. Like I feel like most learning like information based courses you do, it's like, this is incorrect for this reason. Like don't forget, like this is a key principle at play here. Like try applying that, try again. So it kind of like gives you the reveal. It's like, this is where you went wrong. Maybe this is like a common mistake that people make, and like here's why people might make it. Here's how we can arrive at the correct choice or the correct response. And that's like a lot of what you see. But this other like scenario based approach, this like consequences based feedback,
Mm.
it's just all storytelling. So it's like,
Mhm.
we're not going to get prescriptive at all. When I teach people this approach, I'm like, we're not going to use the coaching voice. We're going to just keep it rooted in the consequences. So you make a choice and it's just immediate storytelling. It's like the customer moves up and says or does this. So it is really tying in your head, okay, this action leads to upset customer. And
Mm.
it makes it a bit more memorable, I think. And that's very in line with like Kathy Moore's action mapping. And that really resonated with me. Yeah, I think good feedback is feedback that's going to lead to a different choice next time. And I think
Yeah. Mhm.
consequences are really effective at doing that. But if you can do that in a prescriptive way, I think that's what we're aiming for, helping identify the flaws in people's thinking and arriving at a better framework to use next time, or reinforcing the framework that they might have learned, but just like the repetition, it's like, oh, right, yeah, I did see that a little while back. I need to try applying that next time.
Yeah, it's framing learning as experimentation and failure, where
Yes.
you as the user are coming up to a particular problem or something, excuse me, is happening right in front of you, and then you get to decide, and then you get to kind of see in the safe space of an e-learning course before you're on the job, before you're in front of a customer, before that person is right in front of you. You have an opportunity to say, let me try this and see what happens. Oh, that was the decision I made based on that outcome of the customer leaving. I might not make that choice the next time. That sounds like it's that idea of user choice. That sounds like that's what effective feedback looks like. You're not controlling the learner. You're just putting opportunities in front of them for them to essentially fail until they get it, whatever I guess right looks like for them.
Yeah, I love that approach. And it's like you said, it's like make the mistakes here so that you don't make them on the job. And of course, they're very, wide range of fidelity there. It's like on one hand, that can be a one-off multiple choice question. Susie just came into your checkout line and, this is a situation. Or it can be like a VR experience where you're like fully immersed and people are like, and you're like speaking out loud to respond to the customer in real time. So the
Yeah.
production value can really vary, but the principle is the same. It's like practice in this risk-free e-learning environment, make your mistakes here, learn from the mistakes, memorize, you're gonna, these consequences should hopefully stick with you. So then when you are on the job and you are talking to a real customer, you're going to, yeah, know what to do a bit better because you've gotten that practice.
At least you have one mistake in your pocket and at least one thing not to do.
Yes.
No, that definitely makes sense. Okay, so the fourth tenet we have here is people learn together. Can you, there's a lot in here that I think you'd pull out about social learning, but and how people interact. But what does that mean for you? What is this tenet about?
Yeah, I think that tenet is about facilitating connections between people. I think, like you're saying with social learning, like so many people are learning on the job, just from jobs I've held. It's like you go through this like multi-million dollar like training program, but you're leaning on your peers a lot, your peers, and then maybe the people who are more experienced. It's like you have these messaging apps, you're asking them, hey, have you run into this before? What do you think about this?
Mm,
And then yeah, back when I was, starting building out some more of my offers, I made a Slack channel for just like a few people for a very specific like pilot program of something I was building. But then we just started having some greater discussions about like instructional design and the different projects we were working on. We were like, why don't we like open this up to everyone? And so then we started getting like, yeah, just so many different instructional designers and people joining and taking this was like in 2020 probably. So
mm-hmm.
people were really, isolated, but just seeing the stuff that came out of that, and I'm just like watching it happen. Yeah, it's just people are, yeah, helping each other with so many different like instructional design, e-learning, job searching tasks. I think, yeah, social learning, if when we can design for it, is really powerful. And then I would incorporate that into the programs I'm developing. It's like, let's intentionally pair people with partners or bring people onto teams or host these networking events, because some of the most valuable experiences people have had in my programs are experiences that weren't even designed or planned by me. It was stuff that came from those peer interactions and just, yeah,
Mm,
deciding amongst themselves, hey, we're going to help each other do some like in-depth like job prep for these roles we're applying to and do mock interviews together before I would
wow.
even have any like material to really help in depth with interviewing. So it's amazing seeing how people are able to help each other in ways that an instructional designer can't even fully envision from the very beginning.
And also beginning instructional design roles, a lot of those are one human wolf packs, so you're just kind of designing you're just designing kind of in this empty space in a company, and you have no idea if you're even doing this correctly. You're just kind of following instructions to design training or to use this tool, but you have no idea what that even means or even if you're doing it well. And so I think I've seen within the Slack community that you have, it is amazing that people are sharing frameworks and in particular scenarios of things that have happened at work and how they tackle them, and that to me is better than anything that, an expert can out of the blue provide because they haven't had that particular experience. So I like this idea of people really helping each other as a way of professional development, especially when they can't get that in their local sphere. I just, maybe what is the starting point for somebody who's looking to build a learning community? Is it to, should they start with a Slack group? Like, how can they experiment with incorporating social learning, whether that's, in their learning design or, well, let's just start there. How can you experiment with that? What's like a good starting place if you want to get into it?
I think they're a low hanging fruit starting place is probably like discussion questions even embedded within a course. Like, I know a lot of learning management systems have that capability. I don't think it's as effective because there isn't really like a hub where people can come together. Um, so I think that's like the next step up, is like building a community space where people can come together. You can add some organization and facilitate connections. I moved on from Slack to a tool called Circle because, for a free community, Slack's like payment options
Things
just were, you have
disappear.
to pay
Yeah.
per user per month, and that didn't work when there were like 5,000 people in there all for free. So we moved over to a platform called Circle, but it's the same idea. It's, let's organize the spaces a little bit. Let's try to facilitate connections. If we see someone say something and we know that this other person has some expertise in this thing, let's try to connect these two people. I know, we've tried before, and I know other people do like some prompts, or like some weekly challenges, or like some rituals, so to speak, that people can engage in together. But I've heard some really cool stuff about what people do on corporate learning teams and how they kind of brand their like learning community, and they invite different employees or teams into that community space. And then a lot of, I've heard of companies and teams that already, a lot of people already have Slack, for example. But you might make like a learning team channel on Slack that different people from across the org can join to stay up to date with learning pieces. But yeah, I think it's really about having a space for people to connect. And then beyond that, some people design intentional like mentor mentee aspects of like a learning experience. So it's like people who are going through this learning program do get paired with a mentor, and that mentor has volunteered from within the organization to provide that support to the newer people. So I've seen designers like formalize that support as well.
Yeah, I think that the starting point that you mentioned is people have to literally have a place. They have to have, whether that's digital or physical, they have to have a place to meet, and that's where the social learning starts. And you've given us a couple of ways you can do that, but I think that so nicely ties into the last tenet here, where if you've created this learning space, maybe a place for mentors and mentees, or a group of people coming together to tackle a particular problem, how do you get people to even know that it's there? And if this is the worst segue, please let me know. But that final tenet that you have is learning is a campaign. And so for learning folks who are new to the idea of a campaign, are thinking like marketing campaign, what is that? What does that tenet mean? Learning is a campaign.
I think to me it means this is like an ongoing effort. Like, this is a journey. This isn't a one-off event. It's like it's a journey. It's like there are going to be multiple steps along the way, and it's ongoing into the distance. It's, I think there's a common misconception in our field, or at least this is like the way our field operates. It's like, let's design this learning experience, ship it out, and then we've checked that box. We are good to go. Like,
Yeah.
the paper here says they completed the course, which means they've learned it. But as we all know, I mean, especially if you've ever tried to like learn a language, or, when you were in school, you were doing some more complex math stuff, and now you just like can't use it at all. It's like, we forget stuff if we're not using it. Like, we might learn we might be able to answer these quiz questions 5 minutes after we learn the thing. But if you ask us those same questions next week, we're not going to be able to answer those questions. So I think when we can design with that in mind and realize, okay, yeah, this is a really important principle. Maybe we have some initial event or some initial experience to get people familiar with this and get people some initial practice, but then how and when are we going to follow up to help to let them engage with this more? And yeah, I think community is a part of that. It's like, well, we can give them a space where they can have questions as they have them, and they can answer those questions for other people who might have questions about this thing. So it's kind of, again, that's where I like that people learn together tenet, because that winds up happening. People reinforce their knowledge and skills just by asking and answering about those knowledge and skills with each other. But then there's also things you can do. It's like if you're designing a scenario-based learning experience, maybe that initial experience is like 10 questions long and it's a really good intro, but maybe every week with like, you can assign another 2 to 4 questions, or once a month you could do a little refresher exercise that maybe it's 5 questions long, but one question is from, the questions can be about different things as your knowledge builds on itself. So instead of like, okay, yeah, we covered that in that other learning experience, we don't need to like mention that here. It's like we want all of this stuff to be kind of like reinforcing itself and building like a wave that's growing. And we don't want to be like, oh yeah, this wave started growing, now we're not going to talk about this anymore. It's just going to kind of crash and be forgotten about.
Yeah. A common misconception is to think about learning as a project where it said, okay, we had this business metric. Here's that one intervention. We delivered that training, nailed it. Let's move on.
Yeah.
It's that idea that, businesses are living organisms where these problems, they are going to come back up in many different ways throughout a business, throughout a year or throughout a business cycle, where you're going to target one particular aspect of the problem, maybe at this point, and then further on down the line, that problem will either come back in a new form, or like you said, the company just lost momentum and therefore it needs to be tackled again. And so therefore it's an ongoing intervention, or maybe there's an intervention and then there's ongoing scaffolding and supports to make sure that problem doesn't happen again. But then that also makes me think there's going to be a new problem that arises because businesses are either growing or there will be a crisis and something will happen.
Yeah. I think at a bigger scale, like you're talking about too, it's like learning is an ongoing campaign, right? Like there is going to be new competitive advantages to be had, or new like process improvements or more efficiencies to be had by people improving their knowledge or skills, right? People aren't, like robots, or it's like, if we can write this code perfect, like this is going to just work into infinity. It's obviously not really like that with people. Yeah.
How do you measure the effectiveness of that? Like you introduce people to the problem, everybody's aware of the problem. Maybe you told them that this, you have this course that this course is being built, people take the course. And then, you measure and you see like, oh, people kind of succeeded on the knowledge assessment. Like I know they at least know, they're aware of these problems and they are aware of a solution. But how do you measure what comes after that?
Yeah, I think you would want to measure the impact against the initial goal that you set out to impact. So if you were trying, ideally you would have a metric or a business goal in place that these efforts are trying to like impact. And of course, there are going to be other things that are at play there. But I think that, there's a lot of different ways you can look at that data. Best point is, we want to move this metric by this percent. Hey, look, as people move along in this campaign, they're contributing to getting this metric to where we want it to go. Either, if it's turnover, it's like, hey, they're actually sticking around. Like this is helping, keep turnover down. Or if it's sales, it's like, hey, the salespeople who are engaging with this solution we've designed, they are, they're producing better sales results, right? They're selling more. Like this is great. I think that's ideal. I think at the other end of that, like the lowest level, it's like, are people engaging with this? How are they engaging with it? Right? Like are people opening these new learning activities that we're sending them, or do they just think it's useful and irrelevant and they're not even getting into it? And then if they are getting into it, it's like, are they answering more of these questions correctly over time? Like, are they performing better on these practice activities over time? If so, probably a good indicator that they're learning and getting the hang of this. And then behaviors too. It's like, are they actually applying these things on the job? And that's where, again, there's a host of different ways you could assess that. You can interview them, you could observe them, you could look at any metrics that might give us insight into that.
Mm-hmm. So essentially just always going back and saying like, it's been this long since the intervention, maybe they have these job aids, are like, am I continuing is the needle moving or not? But you're always checking, throughout the entire campaign, beyond that one training, is this moving the needle at all? So, okay. So we've covered the five tenets of instructional design. Just to repeat those one more time: the audience holds the key, alignment is everything, practice and feedback makes perfect, people learn together, and learning is a campaign. Is there anything else that, was there a sixth tenet or anything else that we're missing, or something that's kind of come up for you as maybe a bonus tenet?
I don't know. Yeah, one of these, I had some other contenders. I don't know if this is like a final list, right? I was like trying to write a book and I'm like, what tenets would I include? So I don't know if this is like a definitive, exhaustive list. If anyone has feedback, let me know. But I like if you confuse, you lose. And I kind of, I think, wrap that into the alignment is everything. But I think there's a lot to be said about using a conversational tone, avoiding jargon, providing a good, like a user-friendly experience, like a good user experience. Like if you are confusing people, whether it's because of the language you're using or they're not sure how to interact with whatever activity you've designed, they're not going to learn. So it's a very big blocker, I think. And I think it's a common mistake, especially people coming from academic settings. It's like, right, this is this needs to be professional, so therefore it needs to sound academic or it needs to sound formal. But there's there's good research showing that hurts learning, and a conversational tone is better for learning.
If you confuse, you lose. Kind of like the curse of, maybe wrapped up in there is like the curse of knowledge, the curse of being an expert. So, so if people want to give feedback to you, or they just want to get in touch with you, how can they do that? Where should they go next if they want to learn more about instructional design?
Sure. If you want to learn more about instructional design and see some of my content, I think the best place is to just search Devlin Peck on YouTube or go to devlinpeck.com. If you want to reach out, you can email me at hello@devlinpeck.com or just find me on LinkedIn. Inbox is always open. Those are the best ways to find my stuff and connect with me.
All right. Well, so many good nuggets that came out of this conversation. Thank you so much for stopping by to talk on Video Learning Lab. It was a pleasure, Devlin.
Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.